Hi, this is Chris German, the Apartment Dealer. Welcome back to the Apartment Dealer Show. Do we have a treat for you today? Today I'll be bringing together the panel of speakers that normally speak at our live educational events that we host for landlords to do a webinar of sorts to address questions that either our personal clients have submitted or that were a carryover from our last live event that we just didn't get time to answer.
Switching gears here, is there any benefit to holding your real estate in an LLC, whether legal or financial, as opposed to a family trust? Both Steves, we'll start with Mr. Spear and then Mr. Hall.
Everything that you own should be held in a family trust. Everything, your bank accounts, your cars, your checking accounts, your real estate, your stocks, your bonds, everything in the family trust, because it avoids probate and it gives you much easier control when someone is ill or dead suddenly. You've already got plenty to deal with in terms of grief and dislocation. The last thing you want to find out is that you can't do anything with any money until you get a court order because you're in probate. So everything should be owned in the trust. Then the trust should own your real estate mostly in LLCs. LLC, limited liability company, not talking about your house. That can be owned directly by your trust, the house where you live. But if it's a rental property, you want an LLC to own the property and your trust to own the LLC. Once again, the property is owned by an LLC. The LLC is owned by your trust. And the reason for that, there's no tax difference. That's not the issue. Liability. Think of an LLC, a limited liability company, as a watertight door on a ship. So if something bad happens inside that LLC, where you might own only one property, you might own 5, the only things that are lost are the things inside that LLC. Anything you own separately, your other real estate, your stocks, your bonds, your bank accounts, your interest in businesses, whatever it is, that, as long as the liability shield holds, and if you do it right, it should, that's invulnerable. But the stuff inside the LLC is at risk. So if you own the property just yourself or just in a trust, it has the possibility of liability that's not insured, cross-contaminating everything. So an LLC is for a limitation of liability to protect other assets.
Paul, your take on LLC versus family trust when it comes to real estate investments?
So limited liability companies are great vehicles from a tax perspective, especially if they're a 2-member LLC, because the chance of an audit, statistically, when you file a rental property under your Social Security number, which is typically what a single member LLC does from a tax compliance perspective, is 1 out of 45 as far as the odds. But when you file a partnership, limited liability company, your chance of an audit to report your rental income and expenses go from 1 out of 45 to 1 out of 300. That's number one. Number two, from an estate planning perspective, typically when you have a fractional ownership of an LLC, you typically could have a lower valuation for purposes of estate planning purposes if there's a death in the estate. Now, family living trusts are necessary to have as well, as Mr. Spurrier mentioned, that you always want a trust involved. And so the members of the LLC could be the owner of the LLC, could be the family trust. So you need both. It's just a function of what mechanics does each vehicle play. So typically the LLC will hold title to a property, but the owners of the LLC will be the family trust.
I agree with everything Steve Hall just said. My comments about tax consequences meant that year in terms of depreciation and distributions, that's where there's not a difference. But Steve, you point out several significant and important tax considerations for an LLC.
During escrow, the interest rate goes up. The finance rate increases. Payments go up. Shall the buyer cancel the sale or have the seller lower the price to accommodate the sale? What choices does the buyer have? Mr. Spear?
No, absolutely not. You lose your deposit. If your deposit has become non-refundable, your deposit is non-refundable. That's not an excuse. There are almost no excuses. There are some, but there are almost no excuses once you've removed contingencies that will save your deposit if liquidated damages are initialed and if you fail to close escrow on time through no fault of the seller.
Gil, as a reminder for everyone, 1% that rates go up, what does that mean for apartment values or financing?
A 50% drop in maximum loan amounts.
Now, Gil, did I hear you right that a 1% increase in rate drops the loan amount by 15%?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, I mean, down payments, depending on where you've been investing, Orange County, LA County, depending, down payments, we've been hovering 40% on average, let's say. So you're talking about even heavier down payments.
Yeah. The question will be, will investors have more fear of inflation or capital losses with banks that might be insolvent, or not buy a product that makes sense on paper? That's the question. And debt service across banks overall, I mean, a 6 or 7% treasury, I'm sorry, a 3 to 4% treasury could test these environments, and we might have some failures.
Can I evict if I received housing is key? Mike?
It depends. Can you evict right now for, let's say, April, May, or June? Yes, you can do that. If you received housing as key funds for any time prior to that, you would not be able to evict for non-payment of rent that occurred for the same period for which you received the housing as key funds. So in other words, you were made whole. If you, let's say they didn't pay last February and you received housing as key funds for February, you were made whole and you can't terminate the tenancy for that.
If I sell a property with an old LLC and I 1031 into a new property, can I use a new LLC?
That is a great question. Typically, for 1031 exchanges, you'll need to use the old LLC to 1031 into, because you have to use the history of the federal ID number, the 1031 from property A to property B. Now, from a lending perspective, you could have a separate LLC for the loan for the lender purposes, and that could be a single member LLC that goes upstream to the old LLC. So it's important to make sure you have that old LLC continue the history for purposes of a 1031 exchange.
2026 sunset of estate taxes. Now it's 11.6. Next year, 12.4 million for one person. What happens after 2026?
That's a very good question. Supposedly the ceiling goes away, but as we know through our Congress, we will see a different presidential administration coming up and different Congress, so they could always legislate different rules. So it's hard to speculate at this moment of time in 2022 what will happen in 2026 with the estate tax rates.
I can do it. Just tell me who the president's going to be and what type of majority which party's going to have in Congress. I can give you that answer clearly.
What is the best way to advertise to get tenants? Chris, recently you've got some astronomical rents on your units. What's the secret?
So here locally, we find that Zillow works best. And for a time, Zillow was actually charging. Zillow went from not charging for apartment advertising to then charging. Now they're not charging again if you want the basic platform. And we get the highest amount of response. Their platform is really easy to use because, again, depending on the tenant base you're attracting, that tenant base wants to use technology. They want to be able to engage with you through an app, through a text message, not a phone call necessarily. And so through Zillow, you're able to both email them and or text them, and makes it efficient for you as well. We found that Facebook and Craigslist seem not to work. And typically, depending on the neighborhood, the old sign in the yard doesn't work either, because that's usually not the type of tenant that we're looking to attract, right? We're not somebody walking up and down the sidewalk. We're looking to pull people in from other areas. And so that's what we find. Now, as a second part to that, I'll say, for those landlords maybe are unfamiliar with Rent Spree. Rent Spree will allow you to coordinate the tenant's credit report, pulling the criminal history, eviction history. The tenant pays for it. There again, they use technology. So the tenant receives a text message on their phone. They access the payment link through that text. And then they email you and the tenant both the final report, which again contains the credit, criminal history, and eviction history, of any. And we find that that helps us streamline things as well. Again, I self-manage the properties my wife and I own, and we're quite busy given the size of our family and our business and what have you. So, we need as much technology to our aid as possible. And again, because usually it's millennials, they're being attracted to the type of tenant units that we rent. They definitely want to use technology. And if there's any type of deterrent in the middle in terms of time, they'll walk away.
What's the best type of lease? Is the AOA form the best, or is there another one? Mike?
Well, I think I would not use a CAR form. I love CAR as an organization, but when they draft their documents, they draft it so that it protects both landlords and tenants. I think industry trade leases are great. It depends on which association you belong to. AGLO's got a great lease. AOA's got a great lease. I think I know a lot of clients they'll ask me to draft leases for them, and they attempt to draft a lease that's all encompassing for all the different jurisdictions, which is next to impossible, but we've done a good job of doing it to the degree that it can reasonably be done. But it really depends on the landlord. I've seen what I call homegrown leases all the time, where landlords feel like they've been in the industry for a long time, they know what they're doing, they try to draft their own. Those end up being a nightmare over time. So like I said, the industry trade leases, bang for the buck, they're great. If you're looking for more significant protections, do a custom lease. We can do that for you. If you're going to do it on your own, just be aware of the fact that the laws change all the time, and what you are putting in there is oftentimes, you as a landlord, unless you're an attorney that does that for a living, what you're putting in your personal leases is very likely not only to not protect you, but to come back and bite you in some way.
After paint, what are some good ways to cheaply, under $100, for example, add value to the property? Bruce, you are a fix and flip guy. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts is that's the wrong direction to head. Chris has the right formula for a great tenant for a long time. So that $100 expense will get you not a good long-term tenant, maybe not even a good tenant. So you'll lose that battle. You're trying to save money, but you will ultimately lose money. So I don't have a good answer for that. Sorry. Or maybe I do, and it's not the one they want.
And I'll add to that. I second what Bruce said there, but if they're looking for, okay, well, what are some doodads you can do there to help lift things up? Consider the address signage on the exterior of the building. You can do that very cheaply. Consider the fixtures, the faucets and shower heads and what have you. Chrome is dated. You might want to look for something that's brushed a nickel or something a little bit more up to date, but little things like that. Maybe you don't change the cabinetry, but you change all the pull knots. You can get those online very cheaply anymore to modernize the unit. But if you still, there's many things to consider here. If you still have standard plugs and switches, you might want to consider Decora plugs and switches and paying someone to change those out for you. But these are little things that will, give your unit a facelift.
If a tenant pays me by Zelle, the money goes right into my bank account, and the money is less than that of the rental amount, what do I do? Mike and Steve?
There's a couple options you have. You can accept the partial payment and turn around and serve a 3-day notice, or 3-day notice for non-payment of rent for the balance. You could reject it all and tell the tenant, you need to pay me the entire amount, and serve a 3-day notice. But most people are going to accept the partial payment and turn around and serve a 3-day, or they'll wait. What I find a lot of clients do is they accept a partial payment and they wait till the middle of the month to reach out to the tenant to say, hey, what are you going to do about the balance of this? But I would accept a partial and serve a 3-day right away.
I agree completely with Mike on that. What I always encourage is actual real life communication. Texts and emails are fine for a lot of things, but when someone doesn't pay the rent, a reach out in person or a reach out by telephone where you can have a conversation and listen to the resident and find out what the story is. It's going to give you a lot more perspective when down the road in 2 or 3 or 4 months, things get worse if the tenant is having a financial problem.
Can substantial improvements be done on a couple of units on an 18-unit building, or do you have to vacate the entire building? Mike?
Well, there's no prohibition against doing 1 or 2 units. I mean, that's very common. Not everybody's got the bank account to go in and empty an 18-unit building and lose all of that cash flow. So going in and doing it one at a time is perfectly acceptable. And like I said, there's no legal prohibition against that.
What if you happen, though, to choose the two lowest paying tenants? Can they say, hey, you were gunning for us?
No, because you have the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution of the State of California and the Constitution of the United States of America prohibits certain types of discrimination. Discriminating against people who have low rent is not one of the protected classes.
I like it.
To know if a tenant claims to be subject to financial hardship due to COVID, and you as the landlord have knowledge that he is scheming the system, when or can you report them to any credit agencies or do anything about it?
Yeah, you're not supposed to be reporting unpaid COVID debt. And it's funny that this question would come up because I was just reading this the other day. I had to research the issue. You're not supposed to be using any credit, reporting any unpaid COVID debt. And landlords are not supposed to be using unpaid COVID debt in their tenant screening policies at all right now. Now, if a tenant, for example, got denied Housing is Key funds because, and there have been, Housing is Key has launched quite a few investigations based on fraud. If they were denied the funds and fraud is the reason, then I would say you're in the gray zone. And I think it would probably be okay to report them because they have not actually been impacted by COVID. But the laws on the books are not the models of clarity. They simply say you can't be reporting unpaid COVID debt right now.
This is a long one. I'm from an experienced real estate family. My parents manage their own residential rental portfolio. My parents are now in their mid-80s and wanting more help managing their units. I understand that in California, I need a broker's license to manage someone else's property. Could I manage my parents' properties in this case? If I owned a fractional portion, would I be able to manage them? Steve?
I think there's a big disincentive for anybody dabbling in anything. I'm quite sure that my dermatologist is an excellent MD, an excellent doctor. He graduated medical school, but if I need heart surgery, I'm not going to ask him to perform it. If you are managing a property, a residential property for someone, that's not something you dabble in. That's not something you just, well, I'm just helping out. Well, I'll just collect the rent and let the plumber in when I need to. That's great, but you are definitely driving down the street without a seatbelt on. And if anything goes wrong, you can find yourself getting yourself and the landlord into a great deal of trouble because you don't know the rules and all of the treacherous precipices and pratfalls that are available to you when you're managing real estate in today's environment incorrectly. On the other hand, there are a few simple rules. And a person who is a certified property manager, a person who has studied this, a person who consults with lawyers appropriately when they're faced with difficult and nuanced challenges, it's not hard to do, but there's a way to do it, and it has to be done correctly. So I wouldn't suggest that someone do this unless they're really going to take it seriously, take some classes, read some things, really learn how to do it, and really focus on it. This isn't a matter of going over and helping Aunt B do the dishes. This is much more dangerous than that.
I think everything Steven said is 100% on the money. Like he said, don't dabble in it. There's a lot of pitfalls to it, but you do not need a broker's license or a real estate license to self-manage your own properties, legally speaking. But
what about your parents' property? The question was their parents' property.
But I think he said he had a fractional interest in ownership.
No, he was saying I think the question, the way it was, is if you're going to tell me no, that I cannot manage for my parents, what if they deed me 1% of the?
He doesn't need the thing you'd need a broker's license for is if you're actually handling money
for free, right? If you manage for a fee, you need a broker's license. If you do not manage for a fee, no license is required. But Steven's right. I mean, there's so many pitfalls out there, and if you're going to manage, and remember, this individual's parents are in their mid-80s, and it sounds like it's a transitional thing where he's starting to pick it up. he doesn't need it to start managing right now, or she doesn't need it to start managing. But I would certainly encourage them to go out there and take the classes Stephen brought up, learn how to do it right. And in the process, they're going to end up with a license.
So let's be clear. Mike is correct. If you're getting a fee, you need a broker's license. If you are handling money for the landlord, you need a broker's license. Transferring a fractional interest, again, there's risk. First, there's tax consequences to transferring some ownership. Second, there are estate planning consequences to having part of the property owned by someone else while the rest is owned properly by an LLC. Third, depending on the lender, you could have a challenge in terms of an acceleration of a loan because of a due on conveyance or a due on transfer clause, a due on sale clause. And then you could have insurance problems because the person to whom you've transferred a fractional interest doesn't have proper insurance. So again, this is like saying, I think I'll perform open heart surgery on my good friend because I saw a YouTube video about it. It's not enough.
In a syndication, who in the syndication gets the depreciation each year on their taxes? Mr. Hall?
So in a syndication, it's typically pro rata based on the operating agreement and who's on the cap table, what percentage ownership each person has. So typically, when you have a managing member that syndicates the deal, and you have folks that are investing in the deal. So the folks that are invested in the deal will have a percentage ownership of the project, and as a result of that percentage ownership, they'll get that percentage ownership's depreciation and income and expenses per the operating agreement instructions.
Is there a difference in a syndication between, say, being a general partner, a limited partner, when it comes to the tax?
If you're separate from tax legally, if it's an LLC, there are no general partners, there are no limited partners. There are members and managing members. So the nomenclature is different. Corporations have shareholders, directors, and officers. LLCs have members and managing members. Partnerships have general partners and limited partners. So those are different. Just on the last question with regard to the allocation, when we do it, the managing members get 1% of the depreciation. 99% of the depreciation goes to the benefit of the investors. And back to you, Stephen Hall.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a good point. And the nomenclature, it's because there are two types of vehicles that are typically used for syndication. There's limited partnerships as well as LLC. It's an unlimited partnership structure. You have a general partner that's managing the project, and you have limited partners that are investing in the project for the syndication. And in a limited liability company, you have managing members that manage the project, and then you have limited, basically just members that are investing in the project. So, and then the agreements will spell out what percentage of the portfolio they'll get for that depreciation, et cetera. Like Stephen, you mentioned in your example, the use case, the managing members for the LLC get 1% of the depreciation or the income and expense, et cetera.
What is a DST, Delaware Statutory Trust? I think for the savings of time on this one, I would direct you to our YouTube channel where Chris interviews the CEO of JR Wealth, and you'll find plenty of information in that video. Will apartment building prices go down if we go into a recession?